Right, I think we should probably make a start actually. I think it's the other person may join us. But if I can just introduce myself initially. My name is Tim Dewar. I'm a lecturer here at Salford University. My role here at Salford University is changing actually from having been mainly a physiology lecturer with an interest in mindfulness practice and other kind of psychotherapeutic interventions to kind of the reverse. I'm now a lecturer mainly in mindfulness with interest in physiology. And for the past almost frankly 12, 13 years, if not longer, here I've been teaching physiology. And the thing that's been particularly of interest to me has been the way in which kind of mind-body interactions can be understood through the physiological processes that are present in the body. And I suppose from the point of view of the work I do here, very much looking at it from the perspective that says, well, the thoughts, the feelings that are so incredible and what define perhaps us uniquely as human beings can be seen to emerge from the amazing complexities of the human body, including the brain, nervous system, endocrine system, immune system, all the different systems that interact to give us the incredible interactions that we have as human beings. And really what we want to do for these 3 sessions, which are each standalone sessions, is to explore different elements of how psychology, physiology interact, with a particular focus on the relevance of that in psychotherapeutic context, stress management context, and other contexts where we have the human mind, the human body interacting. And because of a particular interest I have in something called mindfulness practice, which I briefly mentioned before, which is really a particular form of meditation that's more and more being used in a therapeutic context to help with stress management, addictions, pain management, in a whole range of different settings, including NHS settings, GP settings, education settings, all kinds of places. What I want to do is to have both a mixture of some information sharing with some mindfulness practice to see how we can actually apply some of what's kind of cropping up in terms of our understanding of some of the physiology of stress to why it is that practices like simple meditation can be so helpful in actually changing how people manage that particular type of situation. So feel free to interrupt with questions all the way through. Hopefully there'll be sort of things that will spark off in you that you will take us down some interesting digressions. There's a certain amount of territory we may cover, but if we go off on something quite interesting, then I think for a warm summer evening, that strikes me as... So the focus for this first session is very much around the hormones that we may encounter commonly when we experience stress. And what I want to do initially is to just set out some of the kind of negative and positive impacts of stress and the role of hormones in mediating these impacts, but then to look at how we can relate these physiological effects, the role of psychological and psychotherapeutic interventions in managing negative impacts of excessive stress. And because I think it fits very nicely, we'll just kind of drop some little 5-minute mindfulness practice sessions into the proceedings. Because the focus here very much is kind of the interrelationships between this physiology and particularly psychotherapeutic approaches. If things spark off in yourself and you think, oh, that's really interesting to the work that you're doing, then please feel free to chip that in, because I think it's quite helpful to have a sense of that. It's always fascinating to have the kind of networks happen in terms of how people get to hear about these things. In terms of when we're looking at stress, I think it's important to start off saying that stress is normal, desirable, positive, and essential. That if we don't have stress, then our systems just don't function properly. That right now, because it's a new situation, I can notice certain stresses in my own system, and if I didn't have any stresses, if I was so laid back to be honest, I didn't care one way or the other whether this session worked out well, or whether you had decent experience, or we're just a complete little blather, then probably you wouldn't get so much from it as well. If, in fact, your sense of me just not really caring. And I think part of actually having an intention to have a good outcome from a situation of itself will always tend to bring a certain amount of stress with that. But hopefully that's a manageable stress. Hopefully it's the type of stress that at the end of this I can look back over the experience and think, yeah, that went reasonably well. And so I'll come out of it with some positives from the situation.
Can I just ask, sorry?
Yes.
So you're Tim?
I'm Tim, sorry.
Okay,
if we look at stress from the point of view of a physiological understanding, that we bring in some perhaps psychological notions, a very useful way to begin to appreciate these differences between perhaps positive aspects of stress and how they can become negative. Or if we look at the notion that for certain tasks we need a certain level of performance, particularly physical tasks which are energetic, mental tasks which require quick thinking, quick decision making, those sorts of tasks require a certain level of performance that our degree of neurological, physiological arousal will actually help us achieve those tasks. So we need a certain amount of physiological arousal to a kind of medium level to achieve a reasonable level of performance. And we can say that the type of stress we experience when we're operating at peak performance, middling levels of arousal, sometimes it's called eustress, this notion of being a positive type of stress. But if we keep loading on the degree of physiological arousal in terms of how intense it is or for how long it goes on, then we can begin to experience fatigue, our performance starts to drop off, we can experience anxiety, irritability, exhaustion, ill health, and overall we can start heading towards distress rather than eustress. But actually, too little stress can actually cause problems as well. A certain amount of stress, we can be active, alert, interested, start getting bored. But if it's prolonged, and especially if we don't have choice, if we feel we're in a situation of enforced inactivity, a situation where we don't feel that we can do the things that engage us in our lives, a classic example would be people stuck in housing estates without good public transport, without good with personal transport, who just have little social life, who just feel stuck and isolated in the middle of communities where everyone else is kind of going elsewhere. And eventually, if these situations of either excessive stress or under stress continue, you can get a physiological breakdown, really poor health, people getting immunological problems, all sorts of health problems can emerge. But also where there's a sense of that enforced underactivity, depression can be one of the outcomes of that. I'm not saying it's a very simplistic overview, but just in terms of a broad brush sense of these different dynamics of overstress or understress, I think it can be helpful. So we can see that there's overall this zone in the middle for tasks which require high physical performance, quick psychological performance, that we can be in a state of